What makes a biofilm slippery is that it's hydrophobic, meaning it repels water. And of course, we use steam to sterilize our instruments. And so steam is water, right? And so these biofilms are naturally repellent to the steam that we use to sterilize our instrumentation. But even just, being blasted at 270 degrees with this steam sometimes causes that top layer of the biofilm to die and become very fragile, but the lower level underneath it might still very much be alive. And so you've almost kind of seeded the instrument for like maximum dispersal if you throw a biofilm contaminated instrument into an autoclave.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this episode of First Case, we speak with Michael Matthews, Director of Customer Education for Agiliti. And Melanie, we know Mike pretty well. We've had him on a podcast before. In this season dedicated to infection prevention, Mike is going to share with us some information on a couple of topics that are very near and dear to his heart. One is the care of your surgical instrumentation and biofilm. He's going to introduce the concept of biofilms and how does that all tie together with the care of your instrumentation. He's going to tell us today.
I can't wait. This is such an important topic for all of us in the operating room, and it really is connected at the very basic level of how do we prevent infection, how do we protect our patients, and what are the things we can do to make sure that they have a safe surgical experience. So it's going to be a great conversation today, and definitely looking forward to everything he has to share with us.
All right, stay with us. We're going to be right back with Mike Matthews.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
Old friend Michael Matthews, Director of Customer Education with Agiliti, joining us to talk about biofilms during our entire season dedicated to infection prevention. And this topic, I should say, Mike, is one that you have a presentation on, that you've developed, that you've delivered to APIC chapters and infection preventionists across the country. And I remember one of the very first episodes for our sister podcast, Beyond Clean. The topic was, why should sterile processing partner with their infection prevention team? And now we're going to be having a very similar conversation, albeit 6 years later, for our operating room audience here on First Case. So Mike, why don't you say hi to everybody out there and tell them a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, it's good to be back. Obviously, I've done the First Case podcast before, so hopefully people somewhat recognize me. And speaking of that first Beyond Clean episode, that was the first Beyond Clean episode. And so that's something I take with a lot of pride and joy. So I am Michael Matthews. I'm the Director of Customer Education for Agiliti, and I spend most of my time going around to hospitals and different chapters talking about device care and device maintenance, surgical instruments, and how they affect patients and how hospitals can save money.
That is really cool. And I think it's really neat that you were the very first guest on the Beyond Clean podcast. I think that's fascinating. So today we are going to be talking about biofilm, like Justin said, and really breaking that down, because I think there is a sometimes an education gap in the OR with an understanding of biofilm. I want to talk about how it gets created, how our care of instruments may cause it, or maybe the lack of our care of instruments may cause it, but how we can prevent it and all of those things. So maybe just let's start with what the heck is biofilm? Can you talk about that a little bit?
For sure. And you say that there's, an education gap, but the reality is that I think we're still unpacking what is the impact that biofilm has, particularly on surgical patients. And I remember an article that came out, peer-reviewed article, I believe it was from MIT in 2017, that announced that their research had shown that upwards of 80% of chronic infections in adults were due to biofilm forming bacteria. And that's like a massive number that was just shocking. I mean, coming from the OR, we don't see big percentages like that. Usually when we're talking about complications, we're talking about 1%, 2%, very tiny fractions. And I think the initial reaction when they dropped that 80% number was that, other researchers are going to come behind and they're going to replicate the research and they're going to get that number down. But in that time period, since that journal article was produced, that number has not really gone down. In fact, we're beginning to uncover more and more opportunities where biofilms have demonstrated lethal complications for our patients. And so if you look up just in a peer-reviewed journal, metadata research on what are biofilms that have been tied specifically to surgical site infections, you start seeing all the big names that we're familiar with as the killers of surgical site infection. It's things like Klebsiella, it's Pseudomonas, it's E. coli, it's those types of bacteria that we've all probably heard about, and they're kind of like the boogeyman. And we didn't realize that the reason why they're so antibiotic resistant and they're so difficult for us to kill and they're so lethal potentially to our patients is because they are biofilm formers.
And what is that? What is a biofilm former? How does that happen?
It sounds very ominous. I'm just going to say.
Right. Yeah, it does sound very ominous. But the funny thing is, biofilms are in every industry. In fact, this really kind of hit home to me when I was on an anniversary trip with my wife in Cancun. And we had this really cool room that had like this little pool right outside the room. And every morning there was this pool guy who would come by outside of our room. I would watch him and he would walk down the line of the pool and feel with his hand on the edge, where the pool water was. And because I had done, these presentations and this research, I knew exactly what he was doing. He's feeling for biofilms. And think about that. Like, pool water is designed to be hostile to bacterial formation. And yet not only can a biofilm form, it can thrive in that hostile environment. And so when we ask what is a biofilm, well, we've probably seen them. You see them in your shower. You see them in your pool water. If you've got a pool, biofilms are the reason we brush our teeth twice a day at least,
right.
Is because you have biofilms that are forming on your teeth. Now, I think what was surprising to everybody was how easily these biofilms can be transferred to the internal surfaces of the human body. And the way that it works is that there's really three things that bacteria need in order to form a biofilm. The first is a surface to adhere to. The second is they need some form of nutrient. And the third thing is they need some form of moisture in the form of water. And if a bacteria has found an area where it's got those three things in place, it will settle down and it will start building a community just like any one of us would. And the first thing you do when you build a community is you say, hey, we've got a pretty sweet spot. Let's protect it. What is crazy about biofilms that we are just now beginning to learn in research is that multiple types of bacteria will actually begin to work together to form these protective surfaces over themselves. And that surface is what you feel when you touch a biofilm, and it feels really slippery. So, I'm from the country, so I know what it's like to walk through the creek. And if you step on a rock and that rock is really slippery, the reason it's slippery is because there's a biofilm that has formed on that rock. Well, all of those things are present inside of your body. And when that happens, it can be lethal.
It's just weird. It's just strange to me to think that the plaque on your teeth, the pond scum out in the lake, or the, slime in your shower, your dog's water bowl, like all of these things are all being created by the same process. It's just bacteria making little, slime houses over themselves to protect themselves from destruction. But when we think about that and we think about how that translates into the care of our surgical instruments and how we're literally digging around inside of a patient and we're, have all of these things that we can expose them to risk. How do we protect our instruments and care for our instruments and thus protect our patients from being exposed to these biofilms?
Yeah, so go back to, what we said that bacteria need to develop a biofilm. They need a surface, they need nutrients, and they need moisture. And all three of those things are very present on your surgical instrumentation. Now, stainless steel is utilized in our surgical procedures primarily because it is what we call antimicrobial in nature. Now, stainless steel doesn't kill anything naturally, but what it has is a really smooth surface that bacteria have a hard time attaching themselves to. And so if bacteria can't get attached to the surface, they don't start replicating and they don't start creating their biofilms. But when you've got surface imperfections on your stainless steel instrumentation, and so thinking about things like water stains or pits, for example, those things create those perfect little irregularities in the surface of your instruments that then give that bacteria a place to hang on to. So the surface is there. And then when we think about nutrients, obviously it's the materials from your blood that provide those nutrients. And so we're already starting to hear when we start thinking about, protecting the surface of the instruments, when we think about removing the blood as the nutrients of that, we're talking about point of use care and cleaning for those instruments. And so one of the most effective things that the OR can do is do your prescribed point of use treatment. And that's really difficult for ORs because of the time pressures that they're under to get things turned around and go faster. And if they don't understand why it's so important to wipe your instruments off with sterile water or flush sterile water down your lumens, well, that's one of the first things that gets skipped. And again, like without the proper education, you can't blame them for skipping it because it just seems like a box you have to check.
Right. But it's more than that. Saline is damaging to our instruments. What does saline do to our instruments when we choose to soak our instruments in saline or wipe them down with saline instead of using that sterile water?
Yeah, I always like to say stainless steel is kind of like Superman. Like it's incredibly strong, incredibly resilient, but Superman has a weakness, and that weakness is kryptonite, right? Like that one thing that can just take the whole thing down. And stainless steel is the same way. Chloride ions in particular are the thing that eat stainless steel. And what they really do is they eat a hole in the protective layer that sits on top of the iron of the instrument. And that protective layer is commonly referred to as the passive layer. But what it is scientifically is chromium oxide. So it's the mixture of oxygen interacting with the chromium content of the instruments. And that chromium oxide is what protects the iron part of the instrument from mixing with air and turning into rust. And so saline eats that protective layer. It exposes the iron part of the instrument to the oxygen in the atmosphere, the oxygen in your water, and that iron does what it wants to do, and it forms its own oxide, which we call rust. And so when we allow saline, which is water mixed with salt, sodium chloride, so there's that chloride ion part. When we allow that to sit on those instruments for long periods of time, it starts eating at that chromium oxide and then exposing your instruments and then allowing what we call pitting, which are essentially just holes in the instruments.
What about other areas and nooks and crannies? Like I'm thinking about like flexible scopes, things with multiple different types of material. Like you've been talking a lot about stainless, but you'll see different material composition of instruments. It might have some metal, might have some, plastic, and also lots of working elements that, as somebody that has a background in sterile processing, you know that sometimes it's very difficult to clean those areas, especially if you have to brush them, which is another big reason for that point of use sort of like cleaning, is to help remove that gross debris so it doesn't get lodged in there, because biofilm gets sticky, right? So as it forms, it also like really adheres and then it's hard to clean off. But are there other instruments that present a challenge, even outside of stainless steel, that maybe have some compromise of that passive layer?
For sure. And I mean, you're right about having multiple different types of materials that are present. And of course, immediately, I think most of our OR listeners or sterile processing listeners. So obviously we think about vendor trays that are coming in because they have their really cool, designed plastic surfaces that all fit together really nice and neat and say their logo all over everything. And that's cool. But the reality is that that's a different type of surface, which creates a different type of area where different types of things can happen. But you're right. Like anytime there's small crevices, anytime there are irregular surfaces, any sort of roughness to the feel of it, those are all surfaces that bacteria can adhere to and then go to town, creating those biofilms that then present harm to the patients.
So then let's take this a step further, because this is actually where the disconnect was for me. And hopefully I'm not the only one who couldn't put this together. So we talk about instruments having these biofilms on them, and we don't want to put a biofilm inside of our patient, obviously, but how does the biofilm on the instrument, because they're in their little slime house, they're not going anywhere, right? How do they then get transferred into the patient if they're stuck to the instrument?
Well, when biofilms have their nice communities that they are protecting and enjoying, they do what bacteria do, and that is they replicate, and they just keep growing and keep growing and keep growing, and they grow actually at a geometric rate. So 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, and that is happening, every second that those bacteria are present on our devices. And there's really 2 ways that biofilm then, sends the kids off to school, as I like to say. They mature to a point where their growth rate is higher than what the nutrient or the surface can actually support. And when that happens, bacteria inside the biofilm kind of begin to start to die off a bit. And as they die, it begins to weaken the structure of the biofilm, which makes them much more likely to flake off. And as they start flaking off, not only is the dead bacteria leaving, but healthy bacteria are also leaving. And because those bacteria were born and raised in a biofilm, they're going to want to create a biofilm as well. Now, what's really fascinating about this, and what really is the cutting edge of biofilm research, is understanding how bacteria communicate with each other inside of the biofilm. And they do this through a method that's called quorum sensing. And when these bacteria are in a biofilm together, they actually start, for lack of a better term, communicating with each other. Now, they're not like, tweeting to each other or whatever we're going to call tweeting now. But what they are doing is they're sharing DNA. And so if you have a biofilm that is predominantly one type of bacteria that is, vulnerable to antibiotics, but another bacteria gets kind of incorporated into that biofilm, the antibiotic resistance from one bacteria can actually transfer into another bacteria. And so that makes these kids, when they go off to college, as I said before, it makes them even more dangerous because they may have picked up antibiotic resistance from other bacteria inside the biofilm. And because they have that, they're even more dangerous and harder to remove. And so part of that same research that had been done by MIT said that bacteria in a biofilm are anywhere from 10 to 1,000 times more resistant to antibacterials. antibiotics. That was the word I was looking for. Dead gummy.
That is terrifying. I mean, and fascinating all at the same time that bacteria could share their antibiotic resistance with each other, that they could, prop each other up to basically just have this army of bacteria that you can't get rid of. And when you think about biofilm, when that bacteria gets in the body, they're going to look for any surface that they can stick to. I mean, we're going to find them in joints, on the implants that we put in, maybe even on the mesh that might get implanted. Anywhere that bacteria can stick and grow, they're going to be there, and they're going to be ridiculously hard to get rid of because they're sharing their resistance, right?
Yeah. And I think it may have been, it was either a Beyond Clean or a First Case webinar or a virtual conference where one of the speakers was Bill Schmelzer, who was a victim of an SSI related to a implant. And it was one of the most heartbreaking stories I had ever heard, because this guy went from being a successful orthopedic rep, so he knew more than anybody else. And at this point in time, or at least the point in time where that presentation was given, he's essentially disabled because of a implant. I think it was a total knee or a total hip. Straightforward case, but he got one of these infections and it just simply will not go away. And so last I heard, he has a non-functioning joint still. And this was years after the case. Oh, and I did say that it's devastating. I did say there were two primary ways that bacteria kind of break off. And the one is just through natural growth. But the other one that I find most fascinating is because of the activity that sterile processing does to sterilize instruments. And so if you think about a biofilm that's setting on top of an instrument, what makes a biofilm slippery is that it's hydrophobic, meaning it repels water. And of course, we use steam to sterilize our instruments. And so steam is water, right? And so these biofilms are naturally repellent to the steam that we use to sterilize our instrumentation. But even just, being blasted at 270 degrees with this steam sometimes causes that top layer of the biofilm to die and become very fragile. But the lower level underneath it might still very much be alive. And so you've almost kind of seeded the instrument for like maximum dispersal if you throw a biofilm contaminated instrument into an autoclave.
Oh, man. The more you think about it, the scarier it gets.
Yeah. It's less likely to stay encapsulated and affixed, and yet it's not dead.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is terrifying. And I tell the infection preventionist groups that I've spoken to about this, that the more research you do on this, the scarier it gets, especially when you combine it with our, current understanding of antibiotic resistant bacteria, that bacteria are getting really good at figuring out how to survive antibiotics, and our ability to create new antibiotics is declining. And so if you think about the war against infection, we're actually losing that war right now. And there are many microbiologists who have said that it is not inconceivable that a world of surgery without antibiotic prophylaxis is a very real possibility.
Really?
Yeah, scary stuff. Well, because they, at a certain point, they could hypothetically adapt faster than we can create new antibiotics.
Yeah, and some of that is the business of antibiotics, because now the bacteria are adjusting to the new lines of antibiotics very quickly. So it's not just that it takes a lot of R&D to bring the next great antibiotic forward, but penicillin was great for, decades.
40 years?
Yeah, decades. And now you bring them out and they're only good for less than a decade, sometimes even shorter than that, in terms of like being the antibiotic to end all antibiotics, because it never does end, because the bacteria then adjusts. So if you think about it being more and more costly to develop a new antibiotic, and then the return on the investment of that antibiotic remaining effective, getting shorter at the same exponential rate that bacteria is learning how to fight antibiotics, eventually you just get to a point where financially, it's not even sustainable to do it, even if it was technically scientifically possible.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a scary world when we start looking at bacteria and biofilms for sure. And again, like I think this just further emphasizes the need for focusing on the little stuff that tends to get ignored when it comes to surgery. And so for surgical teams, it is about that point of use treatment. It's about prepping instruments for transportation. And in sterile processing, it's about education, and it's about being able to remove the nutrients off of the instruments in the form of blood at a very fast pace, because you're on the clock. The bacteria don't take breaks. They don't care that you're shorthanded. Like, as long as they are sitting on those instruments, they are working at forming a biofilm and reproducing. And so there needs to be a lot of effort made into the throughput that sterile processing has to enable them to both move quickly but move accurately to prevent that biofilm formation from starting in the first place.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. It's terrifying to think about this bacteria and biofilm, and almost makes you feel helpless. But there are things that we know that we can do. There are things that we know that we can do to help prevent, to reduce the risk. And for us in the operating room, that really does point back to, like you said, our point of use cleaning. What are we doing in point of use cleaning, or what are we doing with our instruments during the case to make sure that they are not breeding grounds for bacteria? Can you speak a little bit to the point of use cleaning that we really should be doing?
Sure. So most standards bodies, whether that's AAMI, if that's AST, AORN, they're all pretty well agreed that instrument care, instrument cleaning must begin in the operating room. And the specific steps to that is where there's a little bit of variation, but they all generally say the same thing, that heavy amounts of blood and body tissue need to be removed at the point of use. Now, there's never an expectation that what comes in to decontamination from the OR is spotless, right? Like, we understand, like, it's bloody, surgery is bloody, like there's going to be blood. But what we want to see less of are the big chunks of stuff. And, immediately, I think my mind immediately goes to, acetabular reamers, right? Like, where they come in just absolutely filled to the brim with blood and bone, and they're just all caked in there together. And, that's the type of thing that we don't want to see, because it's just so much of a nutrient-rich, fertile breeding ground for those bacteria. And of course, acetabular reamers, by their nature, have a lot of nooks and crannies, right? So they're very, very difficult to clean. So thinking about those kinds of problematic instruments, and adding to those problematic instruments are cannula. Now, one area that particularly infection prevention really understands about biofilm is that they love growing in cannulated devices. And the one that IPs are always really familiar with are catheters. And so every single catheter that's in use in every single patient, the IP are probably watching it to see, how frequently is it being changed out? How long has it been in there? Is there any way that we can take it out? Or if it's a male patient, move to a condom cath, just anything to get it out of a standard catheter setup, because catheters are breeding grounds for biofilms. And so they tend to lead to a lot of UTIs, particularly for elderly patients. But the thing that we always forget is that cannulas are in place in a lot more than just catheters. I mean, you've got suctions, you've got flexible endoscopes, you've got lots of cannula, you got laparoscopic instruments. All of these things are essentially the same type of thing, and they present the same type of breeding ground for those bacteria. So at point of use, we really want to see that those cannulas are getting flushed out with sterile water. Again, not saline, because saline might actually make the problem worse in a lot of ways.
I've done a lot of these point of use presentations for operating rooms, and an area that I consistently would get some pushback on is just not using the normal saline, because it often represents additional work to have that sterile water ready for the cleaning of those instruments.
I think too, it's not necessarily always resistance as much as it is just a lack of understanding of really what saline does to instruments. It's just that staff don't understand, but then also here we are saying, okay, you need something else on your back table. Your back table is already probably full, and we want you to have a separate basin with sterile water on it. You've already got a basin of saline. If I've already got this saline on my table, how come I just can't dip my instruments in this because it's already here? And instead, we want you to open another basin, put sterile water on your back table, make sure you keep track, and use this to rinse things off with. And I think it's just seen as an extra step, and sometimes is just adds to the frustration of the busyness, because our scrubs are busy when they're scrubbed in. There's a lot going on, and trying to keep track of that, I think, is just one more thing that makes it difficult. But when you break down what saline is doing to our instruments, and the pitting and the rusting and all of these things that it can do, and then it creates these environments where these bacteria can thrive, it's almost terrifying to think of not having it, because, well, I need to make sure that I don't cause this problem. That's how I see it.
Yeah. And I can definitely sympathize, right? Because there's always pressure on trying to do things the most efficient way. And so when it comes to busyness for our OR teams, we see instances where teams that used to have 3 scrub techs on certain procedures are now being forced to make it through with 2, or maybe they're used to having 2 and now they only have 1, right? And so you're trying to put more things on the plate of people who are already being pushed really hard and maybe at a point where they can't do any more. And I think that this is why the educational aspect is so critically important, because we need to be able to communicate to administrators that the reason why we need that extra scrub tech in the room is because we need to do that point of use cleaning in order to protect the next patients who are coming in the room, right? And so I think a lack of understanding has kind of opened the doorway towards people making cuts blindly and not really thinking about the impact that those cuts may have on our ability to deliver safe patient care.
I 100% agree that I don't think thought is accurately put into the downstream effects of pulling extra people out of rooms, because it gets looked at on paper as, here's a scrub nurse or here's a surgical tech. We don't need this. We can move them over here. And it's simply moving people and reducing labor without looking at the effect of that long term. If we don't have enough people in our rooms, then we aren't able to do the point of use cleaning that we so desperately need to do. And then when you look at the fact that patients, if they come back with a surgical site infection, we're not getting reimbursed for any of that care. Is it really cheaper to not have the surgical tech or scrub nurse in the room when you're risking the huge cost of surgical site infection care later down the line if the patient comes back? I just think you bring up such a good point that we really need to see the bigger picture of how much we can affect patient care if we just have the right amount of staffing that we need. And we're not even talking about staffing in this episode, but it's all related. How we can affect that by having enough people to do the job we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is an area where we need more research, but then we also need more people taking that research and what's being learned and translating it into actionable steps for the field. And when I say the field, that could be sterile processing, that could be the OR, that could even be hospital administrators or infection preventionists, right? Like, we need to get that information from the theoretical or the research world down into those frontline areas where these decisions are being made. Because when decisions are made based on incomplete information, typically bad decisions are made. And I think that is, emblematic of what we're discussing right now with staffing issues, where, nobody has enough staff and we're trying to get by as efficiently as we possibly can. But the end result of that is increased patient risk, increased patient infections, which, you're right, those are massively expensive for hospitals. And not just that too, but like instrument damage. When an instrument is pitted and you send it out to any reputable repair company, they will send it back to you and say the instrument is dead and it has to be replaced, right? So that's additional expenses coming from that. And I think it would be very interesting research that somebody needs to do that says, okay, what is the downstream effect of removing one scrub tech from a room so that you aren't able to do these things? And I guarantee you the answer is you're better off spending the money on the scrub tech than spending the money on the infection and the replacement cost of the instruments.
Amen.
It's so hard to tie all that data together. And I feel like, especially with the change in reimbursement that you're talking about that, happened with the Accountable Care Act, we still find actually tracking infections, the financial impact, the systemic causes that are multifactorial that lead to that, to really draw strong correlations to attribute each piece of that puzzle into the overall cost and to weight it. This is very elusive. And so I feel like there are a lot of people or a lot of healthcare organizations that just kind of throw their hands up because it is so difficult to tie certain practices directly to a surgical site infection. And there is a difference between transmission and actually contracting an infection. There can be lots of transmissions that happen that never result in an infection that requires a readmission. If you could track transmissions, you'd have a much better handle on the practices and the opportunity for infection that's being created. But the truth is, we only see it when the body doesn't fight it off.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And to your point about transmissions versus infections, a lot of that I think is probably because it's been covered up by our use of antibiotic prophylaxis. That antibiotic prophylaxis does a really good job of keeping those transmissions as just transmissions and not actual infections. But then that goes back to our antibiotic resistance, right? Like as we lose the effectiveness of our antibiotics, chances are we're going to start seeing more and more of those transmissions actually turn into infections. And so I think this is a problem that is probably going to get worse before it gets better.
There was a big change in the industry. It used to be infection control, and now it's infection prevention. And there was this inherent acceptability of infection to some degree, which is why people didn't like infection control to necessarily be the term versus prevention. Like the goal is zero, but I feel like it's infection prevention and transmission control. Cause I think truly preventing transmission is almost an impossibility because of the nature of surgical procedures and the fact that we are opening the body up to some level of risk. And, when you sign the waivers and everything else to go with a surgical procedure, it's addressing that. But the goal should absolutely be infection prevention, knowing that we have great transmission control practices. And I almost feel like that should be fully segmented out in a way. But Mike, this was an absolutely phenomenal interview. You're a wealth of knowledge. There's no surprise, I think, to the audience now why you were the very first ever guest on the Beyond Clean podcast and a host for quite a while as well. You earned your place on that, and then obviously have gone on to have a very successful career at Agiliti, and for lots of great reasons. You're one of the best educators in the business, in my opinion, and it's great to have you on the show today. Anything you want to add, Mike?
No, not really. I will say you can just keep saying really nice things about me. That's fine. I'll just record them and play them back to myself. No, one thing I will emphasize though is, I mentioned that I've been speaking a lot to infection preventionist groups about this topic. And generally speaking, I would say while infection preventionists are very aware of the risks of biofilms and they're very aware of the impact that it has on healthcare, something that is very surprising to them is how easy it is for biofilms to form in the OR and sterile processing environment. And my hope is that there will be a greater level of partnership between IPs, the OR, and sterile processing to really look at things and say, how can we make this better? How can we prevent more risk to our patients through things like biofilms, instead of kind of seeing IP as the people who, hide everything that infection preventionists are coming. We don't want them to know how we actually do things, but instead actually having like a good partnership where you're collaborating to improve things.
Excellent, Mike. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Great job.
Thank you.
That was Mike Matthews, Director of Customer Education with Agiliti. And Melanie, as you know, I know Mike really well, and you've gotten to know him very well over supporting numerous virtual conferences through Beyond Clean, and then obviously our interviews and work with Mike here on First Case as well. And I think he makes a great case for infection prevention, and especially around biofilm. And there are just some real key tips and takeaways from today's conversation about how to protect your instruments and ultimately your patients and preventing infections.
There are. And it really, I think the more you learn about it and the more you realize the prevalence of the bacterias and the speed at which biofilms can form, it can almost make you terrified. I mean, I've given a couple of presentations recently on point of use cleaning and the importance of point of use cleaning in the OR, and really dove into biofilm in those presentations. And when we were putting this podcast season together, I was like, we have to talk about biofilm if we're talking about infection prevention. And I thought, Mike would just be the best person to educate about it. And he really did bring up all of these good points and all of these things that, while they're scary and they're terrifying to think about, there are ways that we have found that we can help reduce them. And he really highlighted those in the point of use cleaning. And it was just, once again, I'm nerved out about bacteria as I think about everything we just talked about, but it's good. And it's helpful to have all of that in the back of your mind when you're in surgery, because it ultimately is going to help keep our patients safe. The more we know, the more we can do to prevent those infections.
All right, that is going to do it for this episode. And on behalf of Melanie and myself, thanks for listening to the First Case Podcast.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.